Okay, Kinesiology 223, Chapter 20 here. We're talking about athletic injuries and psychology of injury. And when we're talking about this in the chapter, the book goes into things that may predispose people to athletic injury, how people are predisposed to how they handle athletic injury, um, how people deal with the process of being injured. And as a coach who's coached athletes and some have been injured, you have to kind of guide them through the process and kind of steward them. Now, some people are a little more high maintenance than others. We've already talked about that in other chapters. But I have to say, the challenge that you have with athletics and injuries is so often your athletes have a particular skill that they're really good at, and they're identified by that skill. And so as a result, their identity is closely associated or tied to that skill. And if there's an injury and they can no longer perform that skill, your athletes will go through a little bit of an identity crisis where they won't really be able to have the same feeling of self-worth that they did before because of the injury. And so as a coach, you have to kind of walk them through a process. Um, the book does denote this, and it's different when you look at athletics and talk about working with people. There's a difference between being hurt and being injured. Being hurt, having an ache or pain, those are things that'll happen in the context of a play or a context of a game, maybe even in practice, and you just kind of work through being hurt. Being injured is something different where you're injured, you have to come out for a play. You're injured, you have to come out for the rest of the game. Perhaps you're injured and you're out for the rest of the season, or even your career is ended. That is much different. That's a more permanent scenario than being hurt. And the book elaborates a little bit on this in terms of what happens with the psychological issues of feeling isolated, frustrated, etc., when a person is injured versus hurt. Now, many times being hurt is kind of like a badge of honor. You go out and play hurt versus being injured, but sometimes playing hurt is nonsensical. So these are the main areas that we're going to get into. I'll just start off here in terms of causes and predictors of injury, and we'll go into physical factors, social factors, and psychological factors. Those will be the main ones that we talk about for our presentations here. So if we jump into physical factors, in general, the physical nature of the sports that we play as athletes or we coach that we coach, um, they have an inherent risk to them, and we try to minimize that risk, but you just can't minimize all factors. And we have many issues or factors that can cause injury, whether it's a combative sport, non-combative sport, but it comes down to how well we've prepared our athletes, how well we've prepared them and put them in a position to be successful. And the book notes that, outside of the physical or other factors that influence why people get injured, you have also physical, social, psychological, and personality factors that influence injuries and different outside stressors that can also play a role. And physical factors can be like muscle imbalances. As somebody who's coached strength and conditioning, I can tell you we spend a lot of time trying to isolate or define those imbalances in athletes, and you work to minimize those, and you try to find ways to minimize those imbalances, right side, left side, front side, back side, whatever they may be. Uh, but the concept that you have with sport injury is um, you have to have your athletes prepared. They have to be prepared for a particular sport. And if it's a combative sport, they have to be prepared for the combative nature of that sport. If it's a sport that has contact like boxing out and basketball, your athletes have to be prepared for that. And you have to practice those skills in a practice environment in a very much like game scenario. So your athletes will be well prepared when they actually play a sport. So that's the physical side of it. When we look at the coaching component, when we talk about this, we'll bring the slide back up here. For physical factors, you have, is the coach overtraining the athletes or the athletes overtraining themselves? Contact injuries in practice, contact injuries that can happen in a game. There's also non-contact injuries that you can have from cutting, changing direction, landing incorrectly. And I talked a little bit about muscle imbalances before. And so as a coach, you try to do a couple things here. One, you reduce the risk that's associated in the training environment as much as possible. You can't really minimize the risk per se in a game-like environment, but you can you can best prepare your athletes for that game environment, but minimize the risk in the practice environment. But there's a bit of a tipping point there because as a coach, you have to nudge your athletes right along a fine threshold there, or to prepare them for the game-like activity. You have to have a game-like practice, and that increases the risk in the practice environment. So there's a bit of a trade-off that you have to have when you're coaching there. So you prepare your athletes as best as possible. You have them best prepared for a game-like situation. And despite that, you still have athletes who become injured. And when we talk about social factors and injuries, you'll have people who are injured, and oftentimes your athletes will continue to play while they're injured. I did it. I was stupid like that. I played football with a broken foot. I was dumb. But you have different reasons for this. One of which is, you're just playing through the pain because you get like a badge for doing so. And it's something that has this kind of sense of bravado to it, and it's highly valued in our society. If you are in the practice environment, you're competing for a spot. If you stop what you're doing, you're no longer competing. You no longer even have a chance to get that spot on a team. So, you as an athlete, we endure, and they put it here very nicely, they endure pain to reach goals. And it doesn't matter if you're running through the pain of running a marathon, or if you're playing with a broken pinky and playing basketball. It's kind of this, I'll say it again, this bravado sense of what we value in our society. And, part of that is also, we don't want to let ourselves down. So it's kind of intrinsic, but it's also extrinsic, where we don't want to let our teammates down, and we don't want to let our coaches and family down in terms of sport. So, we have this balance that we have as athletes and coaches in terms of playing through injuries, and also understanding the psychological nature of why we play through injuries. From a psychological side, you have, they show the study over here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the things on the left here. When you have these higher stress environments that you have in a coached environment, like we talked about different coaching styles, or we have a person who is more likely like a higher stress person. They noted with the studies, in the book noted with several studies actually, that personality factors, history of stressors, poor coping skills, they all affect the probability of injury. They're actually positively correlated. So what you found is, depending upon if the person has the ability to manage stressors or not, if they have good coping skills or not, if they have excellent coping skills, then they probably had a lower likelihood of injury. If they had poor coping skills, or they had high stressors in their lives, then they probably were more likely to be injured. So I find this interesting in terms of how you can have this kind of really on the peripheral psychological factor that can have a role in a physical environment like an injury. And they talk about different situations, and let me bring this up here. Let me go back one here so you can get capture the first part. In particular, potentially stressful athletic situation, competition, important practice, poor performance can contribute to injury, depending upon the athlete and how threatening he perceives the situation to be. And we talked about this back in chapter 5. If it's perceived as threatening, this increases the state anxiety, which we've talked about before, and causes a variety of changes in focus or attention, and muscle tension as well. And this in turn leads to an increased chance of injury, which is wildly interesting, and there's plenty of research to support this. When you talk about stress itself, you have they present it kind of like on two sides of a coin. They say it isn't the only psychological factor that influences athletic injuries. However, as you can see in the figure 20.1, which we captured part of that in the previous screen, personality factors, history of stressors, coping resources all influence the stress and how it's processed, and in turn, the probability of injury. So, as a coach, when we talked about having a positive coaching environment, working your athletes to create a positive coaching environment versus a very negative, kind of didactic, overbearing coaching environment, that can have an effect on athletic performance. It can have an effect on team cohesion, but it can also have an effect on the psychological factors associated with physical injuries seen in sport. So, as a coach, I say it all the time. You can set the culture, you can set the environment, and it can have very positive effects on your team in a number of different ways, or it could have very deleterious or negative effects on your team in a number of different ways. And this is yet again another example of that. So, I urge you to think this through as a coach on how you would have perhaps a more positive environment to be able to, and I'm not saying like it has to be, you know, super lovey-dovey and friendly, you still have to have competitiveness. You still have to have the will to win and the will to practice to win, which is different than the will to win, by the way. And you have to drive that culture, but you have to also set the tone in terms of the positive nature of your environment and the camaraderie that you have as a team to work towards longer term goals. So you have this positive environment to be able to help minimize some of the psychological spillover that we have that causes or could contribute to injuries in your athletes. Signing off, moving to the next presentation.